Hello, this is Adrian, and I wanted to show some of the examples that I've been working on with cloth. So for those that are watching, I'll kind of go over briefly on some of this stuff. It's a long, like conversation to have, so I'm just going to keep it simple. But I wanted to show here. Here's an animation with some cloth being driven. Awesome. And so I want to kind of show what's going on here underneath the hood and all. So I'm going to come in here and pull up my blueprint class. And in here, I have a set leader pose component. This used to be called a master pose component, but it recently changed. And essentially what this is doing is it's allowing me to add multiple skeletal meshes onto one mesh and like it all be affected with each animation. So in here, I have my character and then I have this cape. And these are two separate skeleton meshes, but they share the same skeleton. So here is the cape with the same skeleton, and then here is the character with that same skeleton. And so this is just adding the two on together, and so I'm able to use an animation that I pulled out and be able to use this, and it applied to both of them. Sorry about that. And so I'm using this master pose component slash leader pose component to add them together. And then in here, I'm just selecting my character and I'm going over to the animation tab. And instead of it being on the default of using an animation blueprint, I'm just setting it to use animation asset. And then I'm selecting my animation, and this is what allows them to both work together. I'm going to turn this off for a moment, and I'm just going to use the animation blueprint, compile that and save. And come back here into the scene. And I've got some wind that's in the scene here. I'm going to pop out of my camera here. I'm using, I didn't make this scene, it's a really cool scene. I did tweak it a little bit, but it's a really cool scene by somebody else, and I really like using it for kind of dev lighting. So I'm going to change the speed here. I'm going to change it to something like 5. And I'm going to just hit play here. And we'll see that the cape's really blowing and stuff. And you might see some weird kind of issues going on. There's a lot of like anti-aliasing issues. I don't know how to resolve that myself right now. But if we can kind of look past that, that'd be awesome. So I'm going to set the wind down a little bit less, maybe something like 3. And then I'm going to start kind of just shifting and rotating it. And you can see here that it's applied to the mesh here, so it's actually hitting the collisions and stuff like this, which is really awesome. And so I can do this in real time and have quite a lot of fun with this. Briefly, I want to talk about the collisions. So here, if I go to the character's asset, physics asset, in here I've got a couple of collision bodies. If I hit the cogwheel, come down to show all bones, I can see all the bones here. And you can go in and you can add individual collision bodies to these bones. But one thing I really want to show is something that's relatively new to me. I didn't know we could do this. But we have a convex hull instead of these primitive like capsules and spheres that I'm quite used to that being that. But I guess at some point we were able to do this, or maybe we were always able to, and I just didn't know. But what's really cool here, I'm going to delete this, and I'm actually going to show how easy it is to make that. So I'm just going to come in here, I'm going to add a shape. So I'm going to just, any shape, doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to come over here to the right hand side to tools. If you don't have that, you can come up to Windows and then hit tools, and it should show up. And under here, under the primitive type, I'm just going to change it to a single convex hull. Sorry about that. If you have something that's a little more complex, you could do a multi-convex hull, and it'll give you multiple collision bodies, but I'm going to keep it simple because I don't want to make this like a super heavy thing, and using these convex ones, to my knowledge, are kind of already getting there. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click that collision body and say regenerate body. And you see it does it for you, which is really awesome. You can also make this a little more complex by coming down here and back into the tools. You can do the drop down advanced here, and you can change the hole count and the max hole verts. And so like if the shape isn't quite matching what you want, you can increase those numbers and it'll become a little more accurate. which is really, really cool. And so you could do this with all of them. I just did it with a couple parts of the body, and then the rest of the stuff I left kind of simple. But you totally could. I don't know exactly like the performance hit on this, so that's not really my wheelhouse. But it's a really cool feature. So and then to apply this, because one of the issues that I was facing is that here in the physics, come on, well, when it crashes, give it a second. Okay, one of the issues that I was having is that here I didn't have any like of those same collisions, and I was getting really frustrated because I was like, why would I make all those collisions if I can't make this work with this? And it was all on me. You don't need to mess with your like additional item, so like cape or whatever it may be that you're adding to your master pose component, and you don't have to use the master pose slash leader pose component. Like you could just have this all on one character. I'm just doing this so I could swap out capes and do other things and stuff like that. But really what you want to do is when you come into your cape skeletal mesh, when you're making your cloth stuff, which I'll go over in just a moment, you want to change the cloth data settings, its physics asset, into your character's physics asset. You don't want to change the asset's physics asset down here. They're two separate things, and if you change this one, you're not going to see any result, but if you change this one, you will. So it's a very simple solution, but it's one that I think is kind of easy to miss. So let's talk about how do we do this? Like, what's going on here? Because one of the big things, and the reason why I'm kind of sharing this, is because we have a thick cloth. This isn't your typical like single-sided mesh. It's not, just a very thin, no thickness layer. Like this is a thick mesh, and it didn't take long to set this up. And so this is really cool. So I really want to show what's going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my LOD section. I'm going to enable a mesh that I've hidden. And essentially what this is a proxy mesh. This proxy mesh is a simplified version of this cape that I'm actually painting my cloth information on. So how you do this is you isolate, you want to have these separated out with materials. So when making this, just make sure that you have, your simple version and your complex version, but both have a different material. And I'm going to come in and isolate this out. And then in here in the viewport, I'm just going to right click this asset and say create clothing data from section. And then I'll hit create. Now I've already done this, so I'm not going to do it again. But once you hit create, you can come back and then isolate out the one that you want to actually have in the render, right click it and say apply clothing data, and you'll apply that clothing data that you just made of the proxy one. What this will do is when you go to activate the cloth paint with the rendered mesh and you select your cloth data layer, you'll now be able to paint on that proxy mesh, but it applies to the rendered mesh, which is really, really cool. So now what you can do is you can have your physics simulation, but you don't have to sit there trying to like make sure that you got every weight exactly the same and your backstop and your backstop radius is all like, you don't got to do that because it was I don't think that was the appropriate way to ever do it, but that was sometimes what I had to do, and it was awful. And so that's really, really cool. And so from here, you can just kind of play around with your cloth settings and stuff. I'm not going to go over all of them, but some of the ones that I kind of want to like have pay attention to is the use self collision. So this way it can detect itself. When you do this though, depending on your mesh, the self collision thickness may be too strong. So you might want to start with low numbers and work your way up and find what you need. I also think that this costs a little bit extra. I've noticed that I kind of take a hit when I turn this on. So just be careful with how you apply this. The other thing is if you have under here, under the Chaos Cloth Shared Sim config, under simulations, there is a iteration count and a subdivision count. These will help with like fast moving cloths or like rigged animation where maybe like somebody jerks or something like that. And then maybe like the elbow goes through the cloth. I will say be careful with this because they do end up being very, very costly. I would say play with the iteration count before ever playing with the subdivision count. If you kind of highlight over it, it tells you that it's pretty heavy. And if I remember correctly, I think it said something about like one increase on this is quite a bit of iteration count. So I would always start with an iteration count first and see where that goes. But these are some of the things that you just kind of have to play with if you're having a lot of like breakage in your cloth. So after that, and we've got everything painted the way we want, which I'm not going to go over. There's plenty of tutorials out there for that. But once you've got the weight that you want, you can just deactivate your cloth, and the minute you do that, you'll see that that rendered cloth is now being applied to physics, and it's using that proxy mesh as the sim data. So then you can go into your LOD, right-click the material, and disable, and now you have your cape, and you get to have thickness and everything, which is really, really awesome, and so cool. So yeah, that's pretty much the workflow here. One other thing to talk about, I'm going to pull up Maya, but you can do this in Blender. I'm just going to use this as an example. Your proxy mesh needs to be triangulated in a specific way. I don't know exactly how pivotal this is, but everything that I saw, everyone was saying that you really need to keep like a good edge flow, and you need to have your triangulation work really well when it comes to lower like division models. Because of just how that cloth is going to simulate out. So for me, you can kind of see it's kind of split down the middle and it's going a different direction on each one, but they have like a clean edge flow for the most part. Where if I just use a triangulation, like mesh triangulate, you'll see here that we get a little bit of patterns because some of that edge flow kind of gets broken. And I think that kind of causes some undesirable results, but I don't know to what limitation or cost. So to each their own. Maybe something other people would like to try out, but to my knowledge, this is kind of how you want to do it. But yeah, that's essentially it. So if you have any questions, please reach out. But this is really cool. I think it's really awesome. So all right, bye everybody.